Good evening. It is a damp autumn night on the San Francisco waterfront in the year 1891. You are a young logger, 3 months down from the redwood camps of Humboldt County, with a leather pouch of dollar coins in your coat and no particular destination in mind. You step into a saloon at the edge of the Barbary Coast. The bartender smiles. He offers you a drink on the house. A welcome, he says, to the city. You take the glass. The whiskey is warm and sharp. Beneath it, there is a faint bitterness, almost imperceptible, that you would need a laboratory to identify. You do not notice. You drink it down. 10 minutes later, the room begins to tilt. Your legs grow strange and distant, as though they belong to someone else. The voices around you soften into a single low hum, and then into nothing. You do not simply fall asleep. Your central nervous system is being switched off, section by section, by a substance you have never heard of and could not have named if your life depended on it, which, in a sense, it does. When you wake, hours later, you are lying on the wooden deck of a 3-masted merchant ship. The California coastline is a thin gray thread on the horizon behind you. A man in an oilskin coat stands over you and says quietly that you have signed on for a 2-year voyage to Yokohama. Your signature is already on the ship's articles. Your money is gone. You will not see San Francisco again for a very long time. Some men in your position never did. You have been shanghaied. The substance in your drink was not a street narcotic. It was a completely legal, respected Victorian sleeping medicine sold over the counter in every pharmacy in Europe and North America. It was called Chloral Hydrate. And in the very same season that it removed you from your life on the docks, it was quietly killing poets in their London bedrooms and society women in their New York townhouses. The same molecule, the same white crystalline powder, 2 entirely different kinds of grave. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history help you rest, hit like and subscribe right now before you close your eyes. That way, you will always have a safe place to return to. Then, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. But for now, dim the lights a little more. Set your phone face down and let us begin. To understand how a young logger ended up on the deck of a merchant ship in the middle of the Pacific, and how a Pre-Raphaelite painter would end up dead in a house on the Kent coast, we must first return to a laboratory in a small university town in the German Confederation, 60 years before either of them was born to their fates. To a moment so quiet, so incidental, that the man responsible would spend the rest of his working life not entirely certain what he had made. The story of Chloral Hydrate does not begin with a crime. It does not begin with a saloon or a bartender or a bottle hidden beneath a counter. It begins, as so many of these stories do, with a chemist looking for something else entirely. To understand what he was searching for, you must first understand the world that would eventually consume his discovery. The 19th century was the century that broke human sleep. For most of recorded history, the boundary between waking and sleeping had been drawn by the sun. When darkness came, work stopped. Fires were banked. Families gathered around whatever small pool of firelight they could afford, and then, in due course, they went to bed. The human nervous system, which had evolved over millions of years to synchronize itself with the rhythm of light and dark, followed its ancient instructions and closed itself down for the night. Sleep, for most of human history, was not a problem. Sleep was simply what happened. Then came gaslight. Then came the factory whistle, Then came the railway timetable and the telegraph and shift work and the 24-hour city. By the middle of the 19th century, the great capitals of Europe and North America, London, Paris, Berlin, New York, Chicago, had become places where the sun no longer dictated when a person went to bed. And the human nervous system, which had not been consulted on any of this, began to fail. Insomnia became the defining private ailment of the industrial age. Physicians in London wrote in their journals of an epidemic of sleeplessness among the professional classes. Bankers who could not close their eyes. Politicians who paced through the night. Novelists and clergymen and factory managers lying awake in dark bedrooms with the sound of gaslit traffic outside, unable to switch themselves off. Wealthy women, in particular, were diagnosed in enormous numbers with a condition then called nervous exhaustion, which was in many cases simply the accumulated damage of years of poor sleep in overheated, overcrowded, overscheduled Victorian households. The medical profession, which had until then relied almost entirely on plant-derived sedatives, opium, morphine, laudanum, the alkaloids of the deadly nightshade family, began to search with increasing urgency for something better, something reliable, something that could be taken by mouth in the safety of a bedroom without needles or hospital confinement. They were looking, though they did not yet have the language for it, for the first modern sleeping pill. And in a small laboratory in the German town of Gießen, without meaning to, a chemist had already made it. His name was Justus von Liebig. In 1832, when he performed the reaction that would produce chloral hydrate, he was 29 years old, and he was already becoming one of the most important chemists in Europe. He had been given a professorship at the University of Gießen at the astonishing age of 21. He had transformed the university's chemistry facility, which had been little more than a small room with a few glass vessels and a coal stove, into what would eventually become the most influential teaching laboratory in the history of chemistry. Students came from across Europe and America to study under him. He would go on, in the decades that followed, to discover the role of nitrogen and phosphorus in soil fertility, effectively founding the modern chemical industry of agricultural fertilizer. He would help establish organic chemistry as a rigorous scientific discipline. He would give his name to the Liebig condenser, a piece of laboratory glassware still used by chemistry students today, more than a century and a half after his death. But in 1832, none of that had yet happened. In 1832, he was simply a young professor in a converted barracks building on the outskirts of a small German town, teaching a small class of eager students how to think systematically about the invisible architecture of matter. And on a particular afternoon that year, he set up an experiment that no one seems to have recorded in dramatic detail, because no one, at the time, understood its significance. He took ethanol, ordinary alcohol, the same substance that had been distilled into wine and beer and spirits for thousands of years, and he passed chlorine gas through it. The reaction that followed was a form of chlorination, a substitution reaction in which chlorine atoms replaced hydrogen atoms on the ethanol molecule, 3 of them in sequence. What emerged after purification was a new compound, a colorless crystal that melted at 57 degrees Celsius, a substance with a faint, slightly pungent odor that dissolved readily in both water and alcohol. It was, chemically speaking, a hydrate of trichloroacetaldehyde. Liebig, in his methodical way, described it in a paper published that same year in the Annalen der Pharmazie, the pharmaceutical annals of the day. He noted its physical properties. He recorded its solubility. He documented its melting point. He noted the yields he had obtained. And then he set it aside. To Liebig, chloral hydrate was simply one more entry in a growing catalogue of new organic compounds emerging from his laboratory during those extraordinarily productive years. He was interested in it as a piece of chemistry, not as a piece of pharmacology. He did not test it on himself. He did not administer it to animals. He did not, so far as any surviving record indicates, ever suspect that the small colorless crystals he had produced were capable of switching off the human brain. For nearly 30 years, chloral hydrate sat in the pharmaceutical literature as a curiosity, a substance that existed, that had a formula, that occupied a small paragraph in a chemistry textbook. Nothing more. Consider what this meant. The compound that would go on to shape the criminal history of 2 continents, that would be used to kidnap sailors and rob saloon patrons and murder young women in their beds, was already synthesized, already documented, already sitting in laboratory jars in universities across Europe, 30 years before anyone realized what it could do to a living body. The weapon had been forged. Nobody knew it was a weapon. It waited on a shelf, in labeled glass bottles, in polite scientific silence, for 3 decades. That silence began to break in 1861. Rudolf Buchheim was a professor of pharmacology at the University of Dorpat, in what is now the Estonian city of Tartu. He had built there a private laboratory in the basement of his own house, the first institute in Europe dedicated to the systematic testing of drug effects on animals. Buchheim was, in many ways, the father of the modern discipline of pharmacology. He believed that a substance's medical usefulness could not be determined by observation of patients alone. It had to be measured. It had to be tested. It had to be understood through controlled experiment before it was ever introduced into a hospital ward. In the course of his methodical work, Buchheim administered chloral hydrate to laboratory animals, and he observed something that Liebig, 30 years earlier, had entirely missed. The animals went to sleep, not the frantic, uncoordinated collapse that came from ether or chloroform inhalation, not the drugged stupor of opium. Something else, something more like ordinary sleep, deep, calm, prolonged, apparently untroubled. The animals lay quietly for hours. Their breathing slowed but continued. Their hearts beat on, and in due course they woke and moved and appeared, at least outwardly, largely unharmed. Buchheim noted the effect. He described it in his lectures. But for reasons that history has not entirely preserved, perhaps his cautious temperament, perhaps the demands of his other research, perhaps simply that Dorpat was too far from the medical centers of Europe for the news to travel quickly. He did not push it further. He did not publish a major paper. He did not campaign for its clinical adoption. The observation remained for the moment a note in a pharmacologist's records. Another 8 years would pass before someone in Berlin decided to take chloral hydrate out of the laboratory and into the hospital ward. That someone was Oskar Liebreich. In 1869, Liebreich was 30 years old, a young pharmacologist working at the Charité, the great teaching hospital of Berlin, and he had a theory. He believed, incorrectly as it would eventually turn out, that when chloral hydrate was introduced into the mildly alkaline environment of the human bloodstream, it would slowly decompose into chloroform. Chloroform at that time was famous. It had been introduced as a surgical anesthetic by the Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson in Edinburgh in 1847 and had been used most notably by Queen Victoria during the birth of her eighth child, Prince Leopold, in 1853. That royal endorsement had done more to legitimize chloroform in the eyes of the British public than any amount of medical publication ever could have. But chloroform, for all its usefulness in the operating theatre, was terrifying to dose. Too little, and the patient woke screaming in the middle of surgery. Too much, and the patient did not wake at all. It had to be inhaled from a soaked cloth held over the mouth and nose, and the transition from consciousness to unconsciousness was measured in seconds. Liebig reasoned that if chloral hydrate could deliver chloroform gradually and internally, from within the bloodstream itself, released slowly molecule by molecule over the course of hours, it might provide the sedative benefits of chloroform without the terrifying suddenness and unpredictable dosing of the inhaled anesthetic, a slow, gentle, controllable sleep, delivered by mouth, in the safety of a bed, in a private home. His theory was wrong. Chloral hydrate does not, in fact, break down into chloroform inside the body. It is metabolized in the liver into an active compound called trichloroethanol, which is what actually produces the sedative effect on the central nervous system. But Liebig did not know this, nor in the end did he need to. What he knew, because he tested his hypothesis on patients at the Charité, was that chloral hydrate worked. It worked reliably. It worked at surprisingly low doses. It worked without the immediate addictive cravings of opium or the crushing hangover of alcohol. Patients suffering from severe insomnia took a small measured dose in the evening, closed their eyes and slept. 4 hours, 6 hours, sometimes 8, and they woke, most of them feeling refreshed. In 1869, Liebig published his findings in a small book that would change medical practice across the Western world. Its title, in the German of the day, was Das Chloral Hydrate, ein neues Hypnoticum und Anästhetikum. The chloral hydrate, a new hypnotic and anesthetic. It was, as it turned out, one of the most consequential medical texts of the 19th century, though almost no one outside the history of medicine remembers it today. The reception was immediate. Physicians across Germany, and then France, and then Britain, and then the United States began to prescribe it. Within a decade, it had become one of the most widely dispensed medications in the industrialized world. The great French physiologist Claude Bernard, one of the most careful experimental scientists of the era, took an interest in Liebig's findings and clarified the mechanism further. Through his own experiments, Bernard established that chloral hydrate was not, strictly speaking, an anesthetic in the surgical sense. It did not abolish pain. It abolished consciousness. It was a pure hypnotic, a chemical that reached into the brain and without ceremony requested that the person go to sleep. And the person, having no capacity to refuse, went. This was, at the time, considered nothing short of miraculous. By 1875, chloral hydrate was being manufactured by pharmaceutical houses across Europe and North America. It was sold in small brown glass bottles with labels printed in German, French, English, Italian, Dutch. It was prescribed by family physicians for insomnia and anxiety. It was administered in asylums to calm agitated patients, replacing the leather straps and cold water plunges of an earlier, crueler generation of psychiatric treatment. It was recommended in the pages of The Lancet. It was recommended quietly by physicians to their own wives and mothers and daughters. It was, in the vocabulary of the age, a wonder drug, and it was, in the same breath, being sold across the counter in pharmacies to anyone who walked in and asked for it. No prescription required, no dosing instructions enforced, no age limit, no age check, no warning label about the interaction with alcohol, which was still 8 years away from being properly understood. No warning label about anything at all. The first bottles were opening across 2 continents. The first patients were falling asleep in their bedrooms. The first prescriptions were being written by physicians who believed sincerely and with every professional justification available to them that they were doing an enormous good for their suffering patients. And they were, for a while, for most of them. But somewhere in Berlin, in London, in Paris, in New York, a chemist was already noticing something that would take another decade to enter the medical literature. Chloral hydrate did not merely put people to sleep. It could also, if the dose was slightly wrong, or if the patient's liver was slightly weaker than average, or if the bottle had been left half full on a bedside table, where a tired, disoriented person might reach for a second dose in the middle of the night. It could also, in those cases, put people to sleep permanently. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was narrower than almost anyone in the medical establishment had thought to measure. The mechanism was simple, the consequences were not. To understand what chloral hydrate did to the human body, and why the profession of medicine, having released it into the world, would find itself so slow to acknowledge what it had done, it helps to understand what a therapeutic dose actually looked like. A patient with severe insomnia in the early 1870s would be prescribed somewhere between 15 and 30 grains of chloral hydrate, which is to say roughly 1 to 2 grams, dissolved in a small amount of water or sweetened syrup, taken shortly before bed. The taste was slightly bitter, but not unpleasant, especially when masked with sugar. Within 20 minutes, the patient would grow drowsy. Within 30, they would be asleep, and they would remain asleep for 6 or 7 hours, sometimes 8, waking in the morning with none of the drugged heaviness that opium left in its wake. That was the therapeutic dose. 60 grains, roughly 4 grams, was the point at which the sleep became difficult to wake from. 100 grains, 7 grams, was the point at which the sleep became death. In severe overdose, the respiratory center of the brain would slow and slow and slow until it stopped altogether, usually within 5 to 10 hours, and nothing in the shape or color or taste of the bottle on the bedside table would tell anyone which dose they were about to take. But in 1870, in 1871, in the early explosive years of the drug's release into the medical marketplace, none of this was widely known. What was known was that the drug worked, and the market responded accordingly. By 1873, chloral hydrate was being manufactured on an industrial scale by pharmaceutical houses across Germany. Merck in Darmstadt, Schering in Berlin, Bayer in the Rhineland. Each of them had recognized in Liebig's small book a commercial opportunity of the first magnitude. The synthesis was straightforward. The raw materials were cheap. Ethanol was abundantly available as a byproduct of the enormous European brewing and distilling industries. Chlorine was produced in vast quantities for the textile bleaching trade. A moderately sized industrial laboratory could produce chloral hydrate by the barrel, and the barrels moved rapidly onto the pharmaceutical distribution networks that were, in those years, being built out across the industrialized world with the same energy that had once built canals and railways. The drug traveled fast, from Berlin to Vienna, from Vienna to Paris, from Paris to London, from London to New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and San Francisco. By 1875, a physician in a small town in the American Midwest could open a pharmaceutical catalog and order chloral hydrate as easily as he could order quinine or aspirin, at prices that put it within reach of almost any patient who could afford a doctor's visit, and, crucially, within reach of many who could not. The molecule moved under a proliferation of names. In Germany, it was sold simply as chloral hydrate. In France, it acquired brand designations that varied by manufacturer. In Britain and America, it was marketed as Somnos, and chloralamide, and bromochloral, and aquachloral, and a dozen other proprietary preparations, each slightly different in its formulation, but each built around the same molecule that Liebig had produced in Gießen 40 years earlier. The proliferation of names concealed the uniformity of the substance beneath. A patient using Somnos in Manchester and a patient using bromochloral in Boston did not always understand that they were taking essentially the same drug. The pharmaceutical industry had discovered, quite early in its history, that a molecule with 3 names was worth more than a molecule with 1, and it had never seen a reason to correct the public misunderstanding, because chloral hydrate, in most jurisdictions, was not a prescription drug. It was a shelf drug. It sat behind the counter of the neighborhood pharmacy in a labeled brown glass bottle, and any adult who walked in and asked for it could purchase as much as they wanted. There were no age restrictions. There were no dosing consultations. The pharmacist might, if he was conscientious, offer a word of advice about how many grains to measure out. He might, equally, hand over the bottle without a word and take the customer's coins. The purchase was recorded in a ledger. The customer walked out into the street. The transaction was over. And the pharmacist, having sold what he understood to be a legitimate medical preparation to what he assumed was a legitimate medical purpose, thought nothing more of it. Consider what this meant. In every industrialized city of the Western world, in every neighborhood pharmacy on every commercial street, a substance capable of rendering an adult human being unconscious within 20 minutes and dead within 8 hours was available for the price of a small silver coin, to anyone, for any purpose, with no questions asked and no paper trail beyond a shop's ledger. The medical profession did not object, because the medical profession was one of the most enthusiastic buyers. In the asylums, the vast Victorian institutions that had risen up across Europe and North America to warehouse the mentally ill in ever-increasing numbers, chloral hydrate arrived like a revelation. Before its adoption, the tools of psychiatric restraint had been medieval in both design and effect. Leather straps, straitjackets, cold water plunges, confinement in dark cells, bromide of potassium, which worked to a degree but left patients dull and disoriented for days. Opium, which worked more thoroughly but produced addiction so severe that many patients, once introduced to it, became more difficult to manage than they had been before. Chloral hydrate changed the arithmetic of the asylum. A severely agitated patient, the kind who might once have spent a night screaming in a locked cell while attendants argued about whether to use the cold plunge, could now be given a measured dose in a small glass of sweetened water. Within half an hour, the screaming would stop. Within an hour, the patient would be asleep. Attendants who had once worked in fear could now walk the wards in something approaching quiet. The transformation was so dramatic and so welcome that superintendents of large public asylums, Bethlehem in London, the Salpêtrière in Paris, the great state hospitals of New York and Pennsylvania began to write to one another, sharing dosing protocols. Chloral hydrate became, in the space of 5 years, the standard sedative of European and American psychiatric medicine. There are case notes surviving from the great asylum wards of that period that read, when one goes back to them now, almost like small parables of the drug's promise. A woman admitted in the mid-1870s in a state of what her physicians called continuous mania, who had not slept, according to her family, in more than 6 days. Previous asylum stays had involved cold water, restraint, and repeated doses of bromide, none of which had helped her. She was given, on the evening of her admission, 30 grains of chloral hydrate dissolved in sweetened water. Within an hour, she was asleep. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, she asked calmly for tea. It was, the attending physician wrote in his notes, the most dramatic clinical improvement he had witnessed in 20 years of asylum work. Cases like hers were multiplying in the casebooks of every large institution in Europe, and the casebooks were being read and copied and cited in medical schools from Edinburgh to Vienna. But the drug's rapid adoption in medical settings obscured something that would take another decade to fully surface. Chloral hydrate had 3 physical properties that, in a hospital ward, were assets. In a private home and in a saloon, they would prove to be catastrophic. The first property was that it was colorless. When dissolved in water or in any clear liquid, it produced no visible change. A glass of water containing a therapeutic dose looked identical to a glass of water containing nothing at all. A tumbler of whiskey with a lethal dose stirred into it looked, to the eye, exactly like a tumbler of ordinary whiskey. The molecule itself was transparent. It made no announcement of its presence. It could not be seen. The second property was that it was, for practical purposes, tasteless. There was a faint bitterness at higher concentrations, a subtle mineral quality on the back of the tongue, but the flavor was so mild that almost any moderately flavored beverage could mask it entirely. Coffee masked it, tea masked it. Sweetened syrup, which was how it was medically administered, masked it perfectly. Alcohol, in even small amounts, masked it so completely that trained tasters, tested in later laboratory conditions, could not reliably identify its presence in a whiskey. The molecule made no announcement of its presence. It could not be tasted. The third property was the most consequential of all. Chloral hydrate was fully water-soluble, which meant that it dissolved completely and evenly into any aqueous liquid, without residue, without cloudiness, without a settled powder at the bottom of the glass. A few grains dropped into a wine glass would vanish within seconds, distributed uniformly throughout the liquid. There was no way to remove it once it had been added, short of complex laboratory extraction. There was no way to know it was there. Consider these 3 properties together. Consider what they meant when combined. A substance existed, freely available in every pharmacy in the Western world, that could be added to any drink in any quantity by any person, and would leave no trace visible to the eye, detectable by the tongue, or observable in the settled liquid. The medical establishment of 1870, having examined this substance carefully in the controlled environment of the hospital ward, had concluded that these properties made it an excellent clinical sedative. They were correct. What they had not asked, and what almost no one had thought to ask, was whether the same properties that made it an excellent clinical sedative might also make it something else. They were the properties of a perfect covert weapon. In the private bedrooms of the Victorian middle and upper classes, another transformation was quietly underway. The women of the great townhouses of London and Paris and New York, women who had been diagnosed, in the medical language of the period, with nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia or hysteria or simply insomnia, began to keep bottles of chloral hydrate on their bedside tables. Physicians recommended it warmly, particularly for women, particularly for the sensitive, particularly for those who complained of the endless small anxieties of managing a large household in an age of servants and social obligations. It was gentler than laudanum, they were told. It was not addictive like opium. It would help them sleep. It would restore their nerves. It would allow them to face the demands of the following day with composure. And it did at first. A small, measured dose taken at bedtime produced restful sleep. But bottles were left on bedside tables in dark rooms, and the mind of a sleepless woman at 3 in the morning is not always a careful mind. A dose was taken. Another dose was taken 30 minutes later, when the first did not seem to be working quickly enough. A third dose, sometimes in the moment before sleep, finally arrived. And on more mornings than the medical profession had prepared itself to count, the household woke to find that the mistress of the house had not. Then, in 1873, something else began to surface in the medical journals. Physicians in Berlin and then in London and then in Paris began to publish accounts of patients who had died after taking what should have been safe doses of chloral hydrate, but who had been drinking alcohol that same evening. The two substances, taken together, did not simply add their effects. They multiplied them. A dose of chloral hydrate that would have produced deep but recoverable sleep in a sober patient could, in a patient who had drunk 2 glasses of wine at dinner, produce respiratory failure. The interaction was what pharmacologists would later call synergistic. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. Alcohol depressed the central nervous system. Chloral hydrate depressed the central nervous system. Together, they depressed it further and faster and more completely than either could achieve alone. The mechanism, once identified, was so straightforward that in retrospect it seemed obvious. But in 1873, it was news. And when the news reached the pages of the Lancet and the British Medical Journal and the New York Medical Record, it was greeted with the peculiar combination of a concern and inaction that has characterized the medical response to inconvenient discoveries throughout the modern era. Papers were published, warnings were issued. Physicians were advised to caution their patients against taking chloral hydrate after an evening of drinking. But the warnings did not reach the pharmacy shelves. They did not appear on the bottles. They did not travel to the saloons or the boarding houses or the private bedrooms where the drug was actually being consumed. The medical profession had done its intellectual duty by identifying the problem and publishing about it in specialist journals. Whether anyone outside those journals ever read the warnings was, in the culture of the day, considered somebody else's responsibility. Somewhere on the San Francisco waterfront, in a saloon whose name no historian has preserved, a bartender was already noticing that a certain kind of customer, the kind who ordered a whiskey and mentioned, in passing, that he had been drinking earlier in the evening, went unconscious with remarkable efficiency when a few grains of a certain white powder were stirred into his glass. That bartender and thousands like him across 2 continents did not read the Lancet. He did not need to. He had discovered the same synergistic mechanism by direct observation in the field. He had learned it the way bartenders learn most things, by watching customers. He would not have described what he was doing as pharmacology, but pharmacology was, in fact, what he was practicing. And within a few short years, the practice would produce in a certain saloon on the West Coast the young logger from Humboldt County, waking on the deck of a merchant ship bound for Yokohama with no memory of how he had come to be there. And in a house on Cheney Walk in London, a Pre-Raphaelite painter had begun to complain to his physician of a chronic and terrible insomnia. His wife had died some years earlier of a laudanum overdose that the household still discussed only in whispers, and he had never fully recovered from the shock. He was told by a well-meaning doctor with a copy of Liebig's book on his shelf that there was a new medication, remarkable and gentle, that might help him sleep. His name was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and by the time he stopped taking chloral hydrate, he would be dead. Dante Gabriel Rossetti did not fit easily into any single category of Victorian achievement. He was a painter, one of the most distinctive of his generation. He was a poet whose work would be read and taught and quoted for a century after his death. He was a translator of medieval Italian verse, whose renderings of Dante, the poet after whom his father had named him, remained standard for decades. And he was one of the three founders, in 1848, of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a small group of young English painters who had decided, with the particular certainty of clever young men in their early 20s, that the entire trajectory of European art since the 16th century had been a mistake, and that it was their responsibility to correct it. The Pre-Raphaelite movement was strange, ambitious, and enormously influential. Its members, Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and later a widening circle of associates, believed that painting had grown false and sentimental under the influence of the Renaissance masters, and that the way forward was to return past Raphael and past Michelangelo to the more honest and direct art that had come before. They painted with a kind of jewel-like precision. They chose subjects from medieval legend, from Shakespeare, from the Bible. They painted grass blade by blade and hair strand by strand, and they insisted, with the intensity of religious converts, that every leaf on every tree in every painting must be observed from life and rendered exactly. Rossetti, of the three founders, was the most temperamental. He was Italian by descent, born in London to a family of political exiles from Naples, and he brought to English painting a Mediterranean intensity that the more restrained members of the Brotherhood sometimes found difficult to manage. He was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was, in the language of his contemporaries, a man of great feeling. And in 1849, at the age of 21, he met a young woman who would become the center of his entire emotional life, and eventually the axis around which his slow destruction would turn. Her name was Elizabeth Siddal. She was working when Rossetti first saw her, in a milliner's shop near Leicester Square. She was tall, thin, with copper-red hair and pale skin, and a face that seemed, to the young men of the Pre-Raphaelite circle, to have stepped out of the medieval paintings they were trying to recreate. She was recruited as a model, first by Walter Deverell, then by Millais, who painted her as Ophelia, floating in a bathtub of cooling water in his studio, in one of the most famous images of the 19th century. But by 1851, she was modeling almost exclusively for Rossetti, and by the mid-1850s, they were in love. The relationship was long, unstable, and complicated by illness. Sedal had been in fragile health since childhood, and by the time she and Rossetti finally married in May 1860, she was already deeply dependent on laudanum, the tincture of opium in alcohol that had been prescribed to her for years as a remedy for pain, for anxiety, for the difficulty of being a working-class woman moving in artistic circles that were not always kind to her. Laudanum was, at the time, one of the most commonly prescribed medications in England. It was sold, like chloral hydrate, would soon be, over-the-counter in pharmacies, without prescription, at prices that made it accessible to almost anyone. And it was, though the medical profession had not yet come to full terms with the fact, ferociously addictive. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. In February 1862, Sedal was found by Rossetti in their home at Chatham Place, unconscious in bed, with an empty vial of laudanum beside her. She died the following morning. She was 32 years old. Some sources say she left a suicide note, which their physician urged Rossetti to burn before it became public, in order to spare her from being denied Christian burial. Whether that story is true has been debated by biographers for 150 years. What is not debated is that Rossetti, on the day of her funeral, placed the only manuscript copy of his unpublished poems in her coffin, tucked against her copper-red hair, and had the coffin closed and buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. The gesture was, in the operatic, emotional vocabulary of the Pre-Raphaelite world, both beautiful and irrevocable. He had committed his poetry to the grave with her, and for 7 years he stood by that commitment. Then, in 1869, 2 things happened almost simultaneously, in 2 different European cities, that would prove to be, in retrospect, more deeply connected than anyone at the time could have understood. In Berlin, Oskar Liebig published his small book announcing that a new medication had been discovered that could deliver safe, gentle, restorative sleep to any patient troubled by insomnia. The book was received by the medical profession as a message of hope. It promised, in essence, that the ancient problem of the sleepless mind had been solved, and that solved cheaply and administered easily, and delivered from a small brown bottle on a bedside table. And in London, in the same season, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, urged by his friend and literary agent Charles Augustus Howell, made the decision to have his wife's grave exhumed and the coffin opened so that the manuscript of his poems could be retrieved and published. The exhumation took place at night, by lantern light, in October 1869. Rossetti was not present. Howell handled the arrangements. The coffin was raised from the family plot at Highgate. The lid was pried open. The manuscript, according to the accounts that survived, was found still tucked against what remained of Sedal's hair, which was reported by those present to have grown so extraordinarily during the years since burial that it filled the coffin. Whether that detail is true or a piece of pre-Raphaelite mythologizing added afterward, no one can now say with certainty. The manuscript itself was extracted, cleaned, dried, and returned to Rossetti in London. Consider the psychological weight of what he was doing. He had spent 7 years believing that he had done the right and honorable thing by giving his poems to his dead wife. He had spent 7 years mourning her and blaming himself for her death, and building his continuing artistic life around the memory of the sacrifice. And now he had reversed the sacrifice. He had opened her grave and taken back what he had given her. He had, in the private geometry of his own conscience, betrayed her a second time. The poems were published in 1870 to considerable acclaim. Rossetti's literary reputation, which had been overshadowed until then by his painting, was made. Reviews were enthusiastic, sales were strong, and Rossetti, who had achieved the professional triumph of his life, began at almost exactly the same moment to stop being able to sleep. The insomnia was, at first, something like ordinary insomnia, the mind that could not settle, the bedroom that seemed too warm and then too cold, the hours spent lying awake, listening to the sounds of London at night. He tried the remedies of the age: hot milk, warm brandy, long walks in Chelsea before bed. None of them worked. And so, at some point in the early 1870s, a doctor recommended what was by then the fashionable and modern solution to insomnia among the professional classes. A newly available preparation, gentle in its action, non-addictive, remarkably effective. A small measured dose taken at bedtime. Sleep would follow. The doctor, in all professional sincerity, believed he was helping. The drug he recommended was chloral hydrate, the very medicine that Liebig in Berlin had promised the world only 2 years earlier. Rossetti began taking it, initially at the doses printed in the medical literature. He slept. The insomnia relented. He was grateful. But within a year, the doses were rising because the drug's tolerance builds with alarming speed, and the amount that had once produced sleep now produced only a mild drowsiness. Within 2 years, he was taking chloral in quantities that would have caused serious concern to any physician who understood the pharmacology, which is to say any physician who had read the specialist literature of the past 3 years, which is to say very few of them. And within 3 years, he had begun to mask the increasingly bitter taste of the drug, which does become perceptibly harsher at higher concentrations, by mixing it with whiskey. This is the mechanism by which Rossetti destroyed himself. The chloral depressed his central nervous system. The whiskey depressed his central nervous system further. The combination did what the specialist journals had begun to describe in 1873 and continued to describe throughout the decade. It multiplied the effects of each substance in ways that produced, in Rossetti's case, not sudden death, but slow psychiatric collapse. The paranoia arrived first. He became convinced, without evidence, that his friends and colleagues were conspiring against him. He believed that critical reviews of his paintings were coordinated attacks. He believed that his own family members were speaking against him in his absence. In 1872, in the depths of this delusion, he attempted suicide with an overdose of laudanum and was found and revived by his brother William. He survived. But the man who emerged from that suicide attempt was not the same man who had entered it. He moved, in 1874, deeper into the house at 16 Cheney Walk, in Chelsea. That would be his home for the rest of his life. He filled the house with strange pets, including at one point a wombat, and with objects of medieval and Renaissance art. He painted less, he wrote less, he slept less, and he took more chloral and more whiskey and more chloral in a slow accelerating spiral that his few remaining friends watched with helpless and increasing alarm. The change in Rossetti as a man was mirrored, quite precisely, by a change in Rossetti as a painter. The precise jewel-like realism of the earlier Pre-Raphaelite work had gone. In its place was something looser, dreamier, almost impressionist, a softness of touch that some critics at the time found beautiful and others found alarming. His 1879 portrait of Alexa Wielding, one of his favorite models, shows a woman rendered almost as an apparition. her features dissolving gently into the background, as though she were being observed through a veil of falling water. The technical explanation was straightforward enough. Rossetti's hands were no longer as steady as they had once been. His eyesight was failing. His attention drifted. But the effect was not entirely one of deterioration. It was, in a strange way, the visual signature of the chloral hydrate itself, the softening of edges, the loosening of focus, the world seen through the pharmacological haze in which he now spent most of his waking hours. The house at Cheyne Walk became, in those years, a place that his old friends visited less and less. William Holman Hunt, one of the three original Pre-Raphaelite founders, largely stopped coming. Millet, by then a fashionable and successful society painter, appeared only rarely. The circle that remained around Rossetti was smaller and stranger and more indulgent of his condition. They played long games of whist that stretched past midnight. They drank. They took chloral, some of them, alongside him. They spoke, in the small hours, of Elizabeth Siddal, whose memory seemed to move through the house more freely than any of the living inhabitants. Fanny Cornforth, who had been his model and one of his closest companions since Siddal's death, took chloral hydrate alongside him. Her descent was quieter, less documented, but by the late 1870s, she was as dependent on the drug as he was. The two of them in the great house at Cheyne Walk medicated each other into a kind of shared twilight, from which neither of them fully emerged. By 1881, Rossetti's physical health had begun to fail. His kidneys were damaged, a condition then called Bright's disease, which we would now describe as chronic nephritis, and which was, in his case, almost certainly the result of years of chloral and alcohol, taxing an organ system never designed to metabolize such quantities of either substance. He suffered from partial paralysis of the legs. His appearance had transformed. Thomas Hall Caine, the young writer who came to Cheyne Walk in those final months to serve as his companion and secretary, described the man he found there. A corpulent body, a full round face deathly pale, thinning hair and a grey-streaked beard, a weak and shaky gait, the appearance of a man decades older than his 51 years. To Caine, at some point in one of their evening conversations, Rossetti said, "Everyone has skeletons in their cupboards, and this is mine." In February 1882, in a final attempt at recovery, Rossetti was taken to a small seaside bungalow at Birchington-on-Sea, on the Kent coast, where the sea air was thought to be restorative. It was not. He grew weaker through March. On the evening of Saturday, April 8th, he lay in bed at the bungalow, attended by Hall Caine and his mother. Sometime the following day, Easter Sunday, April 9th, 1882, he died. He was 53 years old. He was buried in the churchyard of All Saints, Birchington-on-Sea, beneath a tombstone designed by his old friend Ford Madox Brown. Fanny Cornforth outlived him by 23 years. She spent much of that time still dependent on chloral hydrate, still trying, without success, to leave it. But Rossetti had the misfortune of being famous. His death was reported in the newspapers. His addiction was discussed, at first quietly and then more openly. In the biographies that began to appear in the years after his death, his name became attached, in a way that no ordinary patients could, to the growing recognition that chloral hydrate was killing people. He was the visible casualty. He was the one the medical profession could not entirely ignore. Because of who he was, and because of how he died, physicians in London and Paris and Berlin were forced to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that something had gone wrong with the drug they had been prescribing so cheerfully for more than a decade. But for every Rossetti whose death entered the historical record, there were thousands of others whose deaths did not. They died in bedrooms in Manchester and Boston and Philadelphia and Melbourne. They died in the middle of the night, alone, from doses that had been slightly wrong. They died beside empty brown bottles on bedside tables. They were mourned by their families. They were buried in ordinary cemeteries. And their names, in almost every case, were forgotten within a generation. There is no memorial to any of them. There is no memorial to any of them. There is, however, a pattern. It begins in the same years that Rossetti's poems were pulled from Elizabeth Siddal's grave, and it returns again and again throughout the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s in cities on both sides of the Atlantic, in almost every language spoken by the industrial middle class. The pattern is a bedroom, a bedside table, a brown glass bottle with a printed label, a dose measured or not measured in the small hours of the morning by a person too tired or too troubled or too disoriented to count the drops accurately. And in the morning, a household that has grown used to its mistress not being an early riser goes about its ordinary tasks, the fire being lit, the tea being brewed, the breakfast being laid, and only slowly over the course of the morning begins to notice that the mistress has not yet appeared, and that when a servant is finally sent to knock at the bedroom door, there is no answer. The domestic overdose of chloral hydrate in the last 3 decades of the 19th century killed more people in the wealthy neighborhoods of London and Paris and New York than any other pharmaceutical accident of the era. The exact figures were never compiled. No public health authority existed in the 1870s that had the statutory power or the professional inclination to collect them. Coroners investigated individual cases. Family physicians wrote quiet death certificates. Local newspapers, when the family was prominent, published notices that alluded delicately to a sudden illness in the night. The word chloral in these notices appeared rarely, and when it did, it was almost always accompanied by the adjective accidental. The deaths existed, the pattern existed, but the pattern did not have a public name. There was, however, a market. By the mid-1870s, chloral hydrate had been identified by the pharmaceutical industry as a product with a particular commercial affinity for women. Female patients, physicians observed, requested prescriptions for insomnia at rates far higher than male patients. Female patients complained more openly of the anxieties that accompanied sleeplessness. Female patients, in the medical understanding of the day, were considered to have more delicate and more vulnerable nervous systems, which meant that they were considered ideal candidates for a medication as gentle and as modern as chloral hydrate was believed to be. The diagnosis under which most of these prescriptions were written was neurasthenia, a term coined in 1869 in the same extraordinary year of Liebig's Berlin publication by the American neurologist George Miller Beard. Beard described neurasthenia as the characteristic ailment of the modern civilized woman, a condition of nervous exhaustion produced by the strains of urban industrial life. Its symptoms included fatigue, anxiety, headache, muscular weakness, and above all, insomnia. Its diagnostic criteria were vague enough that almost any woman who complained of feeling generally unwell could be assigned the label, and its treatment, in the hands of most physicians, consisted of some combination of rest, isolation, restricted diet, and pharmacological sedation. The rest cure, as it came to be called, was formalized by the Philadelphia physician Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s and became the standard treatment for neurasthenia across the English-speaking world. Patients were confined to bed, sometimes for weeks at a time, in darkened rooms. They were fed heavy diets of milk and beef broth. They were forbidden most forms of intellectual activity. No reading, no writing, no conversation of any weight. And they were, in almost every case, given chloral hydrate to help them sleep through the long empty hours of enforced convalescence. The rest cure produced, in some patients, genuine improvement. It produced in others the profound psychological damage that the American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman would describe with terrifying clarity in her 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. The story of a woman driven quietly mad by the enforced idleness and pharmacological sedation of a rest cure administered by a well-meaning physician husband. Gilman had herself been treated by Weir Mitchell. She wrote the story, she said afterward, in order to save other women from what had almost destroyed her. And the rest cure produced, in a smaller but statistically significant number of patients, death. The mechanism was as it had always been. A woman confined to bed, medicated for insomnia, taking small amounts of wine at meals as her physician recommended for her nerves, would take her evening dose of chloral. She would sleep. She would wake some hours later, still tired, still restless. She would reach for the bottle in the dark. She would take another dose or two. And by the time her attending nurse checked on her in the morning, the respiratory center of her brain had slowed to a stop. The death was quiet. It was, in almost every case, described by the attending physician as heart failure, or as respiratory failure, or as a sudden and unforeseen complication of the underlying nervous condition. The chloral on the death certificate went unmentioned. There were exceptions to this pattern of silence, and the exceptions matter because they are the ones we can still name. Richard Rielf was a poet, an abolitionist, and a survivor of one of the more remarkable political careers of the 19th century. Born in England in 1832, he had emigrated to America in the 1850s, had become one of the small circle of trusted associates around the abolitionist John Brown, had been designated by Brown to serve as Secretary of State in the provisional government that Brown intended to establish after his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, and had, by a combination of luck and circumstance, been absent from the raid itself when it collapsed and its participants were captured and hanged. He served afterward in the Union Army during the Civil War. He wrote, throughout his life, poetry of considerable emotional intensity, and he suffered, throughout his life, from the accumulated weight of his experiences in a way that the medical vocabulary of the period could not adequately describe. In October 1878, in a hotel room in Oakland, California, he took a fatal combination of chloral hydrate and laudanum, deliberately, having left behind a written note explaining his intentions. He was 46 years old. The two substances killed him, as he had known they would, within a few hours. The Rialf suicide was reported in the American press with more openness than most chloral deaths of the period. His political history made him a public figure. His written note made the intentionality unambiguous. The papers named the drugs. They speculated about his motives. They mourned in their editorial pages the loss of a poet whose gifts had been considerable. And then, having done so, they moved on. His death did not produce a public health inquiry. It did not produce a change in pharmaceutical regulation. It did not produce so much as a warning label on the brown glass bottles being sold in every American pharmacy. 15 years later, in England, an even more prominent figure died from chloral hydrate. And even his death produced almost no change in the drug's availability. John Tyndall was, in 1893, one of the most distinguished scientists in the English-speaking world. Born in Ireland in 1820, he had risen from modest beginnings to become a physicist of international reputation, a Fellow of the Royal Society, a pioneering researcher whose work on the absorption of heat by atmospheric gases had established, more than 3 decades before anyone else would recognize the significance of the finding, the basic mechanism of what would eventually be called the greenhouse effect. He had been a friend and defender of Charles Darwin. He had written popular science books that had been read by an entire generation. He had succeeded Michael Faraday as director of the Royal Institution in London. And by the winter of 1893, he was 73 years old, in retirement at his country home at Hindhead in Surrey, bedridden and increasingly frail, sustained through the long insomniac nights by a customary dose of chloral hydrate. On the morning of December 4th, 1893, at approximately 8:30, his wife Louisa came to his bedside to give him his morning medications. There were 2 bottles on the table. One contained sulfate of magnesia, a mild digestive preparation for his chronic dyspepsia. The other contained chloral hydrate. In the dim light of a winter morning in the Surrey hills, in the exhaustion of months of round-the-clock nursing, Louisa reached for what she believed to be the magnesia bottle and poured what she believed to be a tablespoonful into a glass of water, adding a small amount of ginger to help the taste. She brought it to her husband's lips. He drank it. He noticed almost immediately, from the sweetness, that something was wrong. Louisa checked the bottle. She had confused the two. She had given him approximately 80 grains of chloral hydrate, twice the largest dose he had ever taken in a single sitting. Tyndall understood, with the clarity of a mind that had spent 50 years studying the physical world, exactly what was about to happen to him. He looked at his wife, and according to the accounts that survived, he said quietly, "My poor darling, you have killed your John." Then he lay back on the pillow to wait. Louisa summoned the local doctor. William Winstanley arrived, and together with a second physician named Buzzard, tried everything the medical practice of the period had to offer. They administered a stomach pump. They injected ether. They gave strychnine as a stimulant to counteract the depression of the nervous system. They applied hot compresses. They administered coffee. They even, at one point, applied a small electric battery in the hope of stimulating the failing respiratory center. None of it made any difference. The dose was too large. Tyndall's breathing slowed steadily through the morning and through the afternoon, and shortly after 6:30 in the evening, 10 hours after taking the fatal dose, he stopped breathing altogether. Louisa was in the room when he died. She would spend the remaining 47 years of her life in a grief so complete that she would eventually take possession of all of her husband's papers, refuse for 4 decades to complete the biography she had promised to write, and die in 1940 at the age of 95 without ever having finished it. The coroner's inquest at Hindhead House 3 days later returned the only verdict that the facts allowed: death by accidental poisoning. No blame attached to Louisa Tyndall. The 2 doctors testified to the couple's remarkable affection. The jury expressed its condolences. The case entered the medical literature as a warning about the dangers of keeping similar-looking bottles on the same bedside table. The pattern that Tyndall's death revealed was, in fact, one that coroners across Britain had been quietly documenting for years. In the coroner's court records of Middlesex, of Manchester, of Liverpool, of Birmingham, chloral hydrate had begun to appear with regularity from the mid-1880s onward, sometimes as the named cause of death, more often as a contributing factor mentioned in passing testimony. A physician in Manchester compiled in 1889 a private list of 43 cases of accidental chloral death he had encountered in a decade of practice, and presented his findings at a meeting of the local medical society. His paper was received politely. It was not published. In Berlin, a similar compilation of 47 cases was assembled by a physician named Eduard Fürst and presented at a medical conference in Munich, where it was greeted with the same respectful indifference. The information existed. The information was published in narrow specialist circles. The information was, in the sense that would have mattered, reaching the pharmacies and the households, ignored. The Tyndall death was, briefly, a national news story in Britain. It produced, in the medical press, a small flurry of articles pointing out, as if for the first time, that chloral hydrate was capable of killing accidentally, and that its close resemblance to other domestic preparations made such accidents inevitable. Editorials in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal called, in cautious language, for the introduction of warning labels, for restrictions on pharmacy sales, for the imposition of a prescription requirement. The Home Office received recommendations. The Royal Pharmaceutical Society passed resolutions. And, in the way that these things so often move in the culture of institutional caution, nothing much changed. The bottles remained in the pharmacies. The prescriptions remained unnecessary. The pattern continued. The pattern continued because the pattern was profitable. The pattern continued because the medical profession, having recommended chloral hydrate to its patients for a quarter of a century, could not easily reverse itself without acknowledging errors that it preferred not to acknowledge. The pattern continued because the pharmaceutical industry, which had built substantial commercial infrastructure around the manufacture and distribution of the drug, resisted any restriction that would reduce its sales. And the pattern continued, most of all, because the people dying were individually, statistically, invisible. A woman in a bedroom in Bloomsbury who took one dose too many in the middle of the night did not appear in any national mortality register. She was buried by her family. She was mourned briefly. She was replaced, in the domestic order of things, by whatever arrangements her widower or her surviving children made in the weeks that followed. And her death, though it was one of thousands like it, was recorded as pneumonia, or as apoplexy, or as some other convenient diagnostic label that concealed the actual cause. There are historians who have attempted in the late 20th century to estimate how many Europeans and North Americans died from accidental or intentional chloral hydrate overdose between 1870 and 1910. The estimates vary widely because the underlying data is fragmentary. Some estimates are in the low thousands. Others are in the tens of thousands. What is not in dispute is that the true figure exceeds, probably by an order of magnitude, the number of deaths recorded on death certificates that actually named the drug. The rest are hidden inside other diagnoses. The rest are the deaths that the medical culture of the period had decided, quietly and without public discussion, not to see. In the bedrooms of the industrial middle class, chloral hydrate killed by accident. It killed people who had trusted it, who had been prescribed it, who had bought it in good faith from respectable pharmacies. It killed them slowly and quietly, and mostly at night. And it did so for 40 years, while the medical profession that had released it into the world continued to prescribe it, and while the pharmaceutical industry that manufactured it continued to expand its markets, and while the public health authorities that might have restricted it continued to defer to the professional judgment of physicians and to the commercial interests of pharmacists. But something else was happening at the same time, in a different set of buildings on a different continent. In Chicago in particular, chloral hydrate was not killing by accident. It was being deployed with growing precision and expanding organization as an instrument of open commercial crime. In London bedrooms, it killed by mistake. In Chicago saloons, it was about to kill by design. In London bedrooms, it killed by mistake. In Chicago saloons, it was about to kill by design. The transformation was not slow. Between the death of Dante Gabriel Rossetti at Birchington-on-Sea in April 1882 and the opening of the Lone Star Saloon on South State Street in Chicago in 1896, only 14 years passed. In that span, chloral hydrate migrated in the American imagination from a fashionable pharmaceutical whose casualties were, when noticed at all, treated as unfortunate accidents in respectable households, into an instrument of daily commercial predation on the streets of the American Midwest. The molecule had not changed. The pharmacology had not changed. What had changed was the setting and the intent and the class of person now being killed. To understand what happened in Chicago, you must first understand the city. In 1896, Chicago was the fastest growing large metropolis on the North American continent, a place that had burned to the ground in 1871 and rebuilt itself in the space of a single generation into the third largest city in the United States, with a population of well over 1 million people, the majority of whom had arrived in the previous 20 years from Ireland, from Germany, from Italy, from Poland, from the rural American South, from every place in the world where the promise of industrial wages had proved stronger than the pull of home. Chicago in the 1890s was a city of stockyards, of railroads, of grain elevators, of steel mills, of vast slaughterhouses that killed and processed livestock at a scale the world had never seen before. It was also a city, more than any other American city of its period, of open and semi-organized municipal corruption. The corruption was concentrated in a district known as the Levee. The Levee sat immediately south of the Loop, in the first ward of the city, and it was, by the practical understanding of the police, the aldermen, the newspapers, and the reformers, an unofficial zone in which the ordinary laws of Illinois and the United States were, for a small and reliable consideration, not enforced. Within the levee were saloons that stayed open 24 hours, brothels that operated openly on ground floors, gambling houses that occupied entire buildings, opium dens that catered to a small and secretive clientele, and along a particular stretch of South State Street, in a concentration so dense that the papers of the day had given it its own nickname, an unbroken row of drinking establishments that everyone called Whiskey Row. Michael Finn was born in Chicago in 1871, the year of the Great Fire, into a poor Irish immigrant family whose exact circumstances no historian has been able to fully reconstruct. His early years were in the classic pattern of the American underclass of the period, a series of small crimes and short sentences and long apprenticeships in the informal economy of the streets. He was, by his early 20s, a known figure in the police records of the First Ward, a pickpocket, a fence, an occasional strong-arm man, a person whose face the beat officers recognized and whose small operations they were sometimes paid to overlook. He was not remarkable. There were thousands of men like him in Chicago in the 1890s, and most of them are known to history only through the census records that occasionally caught them at a fixed address. What made Finn different was that in 1896, at the age of 25, he acquired, through means that the surviving documents do not entirely clarify, the lease on a modest establishment at 527 South State Street, in the heart of Whiskey Row, and hung above the door a wooden sign that read, Lone Star Saloon and Palm Garden Restaurant. It was, by all accounts, an unremarkable place. Rough wooden floors, a long dark bar, a back room with a few mattresses and a scattering of small tables, a few faded pictures on the walls. The Palm Garden part of the name, which suggested some kind of decorative botanical space, was aspirational to the point of dishonesty. There was, so far as anyone recorded, no palm. There was no garden. There was only the saloon and the back rooms and the small group of women who worked there as prostitutes, and in due course as accomplices to the operation that would eventually make Finn's name into an English noun. For the first 2 years, the Lone Star operated as many levee saloons operated: cheap liquor, coordinated pickpocketing of drunken patrons, a modest sideline in prostitution, a steady undercurrent of low-grade violence. The chloral that had killed Rossetti slowly, over a decade, through the sad architecture of grief and self-destruction, was about to be deployed by men in Chicago who had never heard of Rossetti and who cared nothing for grief. What they cared about was efficiency. They cared about how many dollars they could extract from how many drunken customers with how little labor and how little risk of arrest. And in 1898, Finn met the man who would show him how to answer that question. His name, or the name by which he was known in the levee, was Dr. Hall. He was, by the fragmentary accounts that survived him, an eccentric figure who operated at the margins of the district's economy, part street pharmacist, part voodoo practitioner, part conman, part supplier of dubious substances to whichever local operators asked for them. He sold what he called love potions to lonely men. He sold trinkets and amulets to superstitious women. He sold cocaine and heroin, both of which were still legal in Illinois in 1898 to whoever wanted them. And in the course of his conversations with Mickey Finn, at some point in the year 1898, he introduced Finn to a substance that he supplied in small brown bottles and referred to only as his special medicine. The substance was chloral hydrate. Dr. Hall had almost certainly obtained it from ordinary pharmaceutical channels. A Chicago pharmacy, a wholesaler, perhaps a corrupt hospital orderly, since it was, as always, legal to purchase in any quantity by any adult. What Dr. Hall had understood, either from his own observation or from the same underworld gossip that had already reached bartenders across America, was the synergistic mechanism. Chloral in whiskey did not merely put a man to sleep. It removed him for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, from any capacity to remember, to resist, or to identify what had happened to him. Finn, upon receiving this information, did what a man in his position and profession would inevitably do. He tested it. He developed a house cocktail. He gave it a name, the Mickey Finn Special, as it came to be known on the sign above the bar, was a drink that Finn charged more for than his ordinary whiskey. A house specialty, a marketing gimmick, meant to signal that whoever ordered it had money to spend and did not mind spending it. According to the court testimony later given by the women who worked at the Lone Star, the special was a mixture of raw alcohol, several dashes of Tabasco sauce for heat, a splash of what Finn called snuff-soaked water for color, and a measured pour from Dr. Hall's small brown bottle. The recipe was designed to disguise the taste of the chloral hydrate behind so many other assertive flavors that a customer would be tasting fire and grit and unfamiliar sweetness and would not be able to identify what any single component of the mixture might actually be. The special was, in essence, a delivery mechanism. It was chloral hydrate disguised as showmanship, and it worked. The mechanism of the operation after the special was ordered and drunk was as simple as it was cruel. Within 10 to 20 minutes, the customer would begin to feel the peculiar heaviness that chloral produces in a drinker. He would slump forward on the bar. He might be helped to a chair. Within half an hour, he would be entirely unconscious. At this point, the coordinated part of the operation began. One of the house girls, women whose testimony would eventually convict Finn, and whose stories the newspapers of 1903 would repeat with a mixture of moralism and voyeuristic pity, would signal the bartender. Finn or one of his associates would then help the unconscious customer, as though he were a harmless drunk, being escorted for his own safety into one of the small back rooms behind the bar. The rooms were, in the language of the operation, the operating rooms. In the back room, the customer would be systematically searched, his pockets emptied, his wallet taken, his watch removed, his coat and sometimes his shoes stripped from him if they had resale value. The proceeds were divided according to a fixed schedule, a share to Finn, a share to the bartender who had prepared and served the drink, a share to the house girl who had signaled the process. When the search was complete, the customer, still deeply unconscious and often now stripped to his underclothes, would be dragged by a rear door into the alley behind the saloon, or occasionally into an alley several blocks away, and left there. 12 hours later, sometimes more, he would wake in a state of profound confusion, with no memory of the preceding evening, no money, no coat, no watch, and no clear idea of how he had come to be lying in a Chicago alley in the middle of the day. If he complained to the police, which many victims did not out of embarrassment, the police, having received their share of the ongoing protection payments from the First Ward's political machinery, would take his statement, file a report, and do nothing further. The political architecture that permitted the Lone Star to operate was as important to its success as the chloral itself. The First Ward, in which the levy sat, was represented in the Chicago City Council by two aldermen who had become, by the 1890s, national figures in the history of American municipal corruption. Michael Kenner, known throughout the city as Hinky Dink, ran the ward's political operation from a saloon called the Working Man's Exchange. John Coughlin, known as Bathhouse. John, for his early career managing a Turkish bath, provided the flamboyant public face of the operation, appearing at official functions in green and lavender suits of a cut that made his political rivals wonder whether he was serious. Between them, Kenner and Coughlin controlled the ward's votes, the ward's police assignments, the ward's saloon licenses, and the ward's daily flow of protection money from every illegal operation within the district. Finn, like every other saloon keeper on Whiskey Row, paid his share. In return, he was permitted to operate. Consider what this meant. A drug that had been developed in a German laboratory to cure Victorian insomnia, that had been introduced into clinical medicine with the sincere hope of relieving human suffering, was now being administered in a system so organized that it required its own protection payments and its own political sponsors and its own dedicated backrooms to strangers who had walked into a saloon expecting only a drink. The molecule was the same. The chemistry was the same. What had happened between Liebig's Berlin and Finn's Chicago was that the entire moral apparatus surrounding the drug had collapsed. And once the apparatus had collapsed, the drug did what any efficient tool will do in the hands of anyone who wants to use it. It performed. For 7 years, the arrangement held. The special was ordered. The customers slumped. The alleys received their unconscious bodies, and the operation would have continued indefinitely, in all probability, had it not been for one of the women at the center of it, deciding that she could no longer bear what she was participating in. Her name was Mary Thornton, and everyone in the levee called her Gold-Tooth Mary. She had worked at the Lone Star since the early years of the operation. She had signaled the bartender in more drug and rob episodes than she could count. And by the fall of 1903, for reasons that the surviving court records do not entirely explain, but that seem to have involved a combination of accumulated guilt and a specific dispute with Finn over money, she had decided to talk. Along with another of the house girls, referred to in the records only as the dummy, Mary Thornton went to the Chicago police in early December 1903 and gave a detailed statement about the workings of the Mickey Finn special. She named the substance. She named the recipe. She named the schedule by which the proceeds had been divided. She named, in due course, at least a dozen specific victims, whose robberies she could remember, with sufficient clarity to describe them to a court. The police this time could not simply file the report and do nothing. The reformist mayor Carter Harrison the Younger had come into office with a mandate to clean up at least the most visible excesses of the levee, and Thornton's testimony was too specific, too corroborated, and too newsworthy to be quietly buried. On December 16, 1903, on the direct order of Mayor Harrison, the Lone Star Saloon and Palm Garden Restaurant had its liquor license revoked. Chicago police raided the premises. The next morning, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported on Finn's indictment. The Daily News described the saloon as the scene of blood-curdling crimes through the agency of drugged liquor. The Inter-Ocean announced that Finn's alleged knockout drops had put him out of business. Finn himself was formally charged, but the charges, for reasons that involved the fragility of the witnesses, the reluctance of victims to come forward publicly, and the continuing political influence of Kenner and Coughlin, did not stick in any serious way. Finn was not sent to prison. He was not, in the end, seriously punished at all. What he was closed down. The Lone Star was finished, and Finn, having sold the formula for his special to a number of other Southside saloon keepers who continued to serve variations of it under the same brand name, quietly left Chicago and disappeared from the historical record. His date and place of death are unknown. He is believed to have died sometime before 1930, in obscurity, in some other American city, under some other name. But the name he had left behind did not disappear. By 1915, 12 years after the closure of the Lone Star, the term Mickey Finn had entered the American language as a general noun for any drink laced with an incapacitating agent, a piece of underworld slang so vivid and so useful that it survived the disappearance of its namesake and continues in English dictionaries to this day. Herbert Asbury, in his 1940 book Gem of the Prairie, An Informal History of the Chicago Underworld, gave the fullest surviving account of the Lone Star and made Finn a permanent figure in the popular history of Chicago crime. Every subsequent movie, novel, and radio drama that showed a bartender slipping a drug into a hero's drink was, whether it knew it or not, referring back to a small saloon on South State Street and to the small brown bottle that had once sat behind its bar. But Mickey Finn had never been unique. He had only been visible. There were thousands of Lone Stars scattered across the port cities and the industrial cities of the Western world. Establishments whose names have not survived, whose operators are not remembered, whose victims were dumped in alleys from which they never fully returned. What Finn had done in Chicago, other men had been doing for decades in San Francisco, in Portland, in Liverpool, in London. And in some of those cities, the drug had been put to a use even more terrible than the one Finn had made of it. He had only been visible. There were thousands of Lone Stars scattered across the port cities and the industrial cities of the Western world. Establishments whose names have not survived, whose operators are not remembered, whose victims were dumped in alleys from which they never fully returned. What Finn had done in Chicago, other men had been doing for decades in San Francisco, in Portland, in Liverpool, in London. And in some of those cities, the drug had been put to a use even more terrible than the one Finn had made of it. The practice was called Shanghaiing or crimping, and it was the systematic kidnapping of men through drugging and coercion to serve as unpaid or minimally paid crew members on merchant sailing ships. The name derived from the common destination of such vessels, the Chinese port of Shanghai, though the practice was carried out in cities across the Pacific and the Atlantic. It had begun in the sailing ship era of the 1840s and 1850s, driven by a chronic shortage of voluntary seamen willing to submit to the brutal conditions and low pay of long merchant voyages. And by the 1890s, it had grown into an organized industry, an industry whose primary tool, after decades of experimentation with clubs and sandbags and cheap alcohol, had settled on chloral hydrate. In San Francisco, the practice had its own local aristocracy of operators. James Kelly, known throughout the waterfront as Shanghai Kelly, ran a boarding house near Davis and Chambers Streets, from which he supplied crews to outbound merchant vessels. Kelly's methods were direct. He would send runners out to arriving ships to lure sailors ashore with promises of free drink and comfortable lodging. Once inside his establishment, they would be given a house cocktail, a mixture of gin and beer and other spirits laced with laudanum, opium, or chloral hydrate. And when the drug took effect, they would be lowered through one of 3 trapdoors set into the floor of the front bar and rowed out to whichever ship had paid Kelly's fee. The captain of the vessel would sign the men's names on the ship's articles, claim their first 2 or 3 months of wages as his own compensation for the crimp's fee, and set sail. The men would wake, sometimes, days later, already at sea, already legally bound to a voyage they had not agreed to. Kelly's operation was one of the most famous, but it was not the only one. A woman known only as Miss Piggott operated a competing saloon nearby, where she served what the waterfront called the Miss Piggott Special, whiskey and brandy and gin in equal parts, laced with laudanum or opium or chloral hydrate, depending on what was available. Miss Piggott's saloon was equipped, like Kelly's, with a trapdoor, over which she maneuvered her intended victims. When the drug took effect and the customer collapsed, she would pull a lever, and the man would drop through the floor onto a mattress in the basement, from which he would be transported to whichever ship was waiting. If the drug was slow to act or the customer proved unusually resistant, she was known to complete the process with a wooden club that she kept beneath the bar. The scale of Shanghaiing in the last quarter of the 19th century is difficult to estimate precisely because the crime was, by its nature, poorly documented. The best surviving figures suggest that in San Francisco alone, at various points in the second half of the century, more than 20 organized crimping gangs were competing for business. In the 1890s, British consular officials estimated that approximately 800 British seamen were disappearing each year from American ports without any record of voluntary enlistment. Men who had, in the polite language of the diplomatic dispatches, been shipped without their consent. In Portland, Oregon, which had surpassed San Francisco as the busiest Shanghaiing port by the turn of the century, entire waterfront neighborhoods were structured around the trade. The victims were loggers, unemployed laborers, transient farm workers, and increasingly, in the more predatory operations, ordinary citizens who had made the mistake of accepting a free drink in the wrong establishment. There were, in other words, tens of thousands of men who lived through some version of what our young logger from Humboldt County lived through in the hook of this story. Most of them were never named. Most of them, if they returned home at all, did so months or years later, with wages that had been mostly claimed by the ship's captain and a story that few people believed. Some of them did not return at all, and chloral hydrate, meanwhile, was being used to kill in ways that were even more targeted and more terrible than the impersonal machinery of the crimping trade. On the evening of October 18th, 1900, in the silk mill town of Paterson, New Jersey, a 17-year-old girl named Jenny Bosquita left the small house on East 5th Street, where she lived with her parents, her older sister Susan, and her younger brother Joseph, and walked to a nearby drugstore to buy baby powder for a young niece. Jenny was a Dutch immigrant. She worked at the Paterson Ribbon Company on Vreeland Avenue, tending machines that produced the woven silk ribbons for which Paterson was, in that period, briefly famous. She was, by every surviving account, an ordinary young woman making an ordinary evening errand. At the drugstore, she encountered two men she knew slightly. William Death, his surname pronounced Deeth, was a young man she had briefly dated before he had married another woman a few weeks earlier. Andrew Campbell was a friend of his. While Jenny was inside the store, a third and wealthier young man named Walter McAllister, the son of a local silk mill owner, approached Death and suggested that they invite Jenny to join them at a nearby saloon. She accepted the invitation. She walked with them to Saal's saloon at the corner of River Street and Bridge Street, where a fourth man, George Kerr, joined them. They took a private room in the back. Over the course of the evening, McAllister ordered Jenny a series of drinks, a Manhattan possibly, then an absinthe frap, then 2 glasses of Great Western sparkling wine, and into the sparkling wine, over the course of 2 or 3 separate glasses, he stirred repeated doses of chloral hydrate, which he had purchased earlier that day without prescription from a Paterson pharmacy, in a form and at a price that no local law restricted in any way. By midnight, Jenny was unconscious. The 4 men carried her out of the saloon and into a waiting carriage driven by a man named Augustus Sculthorpe, who was told to drive them into the countryside north of the town. They stopped on Rock Road, 4 miles from Patterson. In a clearing beside the road, they took her body from the carriage. They assaulted her, and by the time they finished, she was dead. They dumped her body near the Wagaraw Bridge on the Passaic River, where a man named Marinus Gary, on his way to work at a local feed mill, discovered her at about 6 the following morning. Her death, when the details became known, produced a national scandal. All 4 men were tried in January 1901. All 4 were convicted. McAllister, Campbell, and Death received 30-year sentences for second-degree murder. Kerr, whose brother happened to be a judge, received 15 years for a lesser charge. The verdicts satisfied few of the people who followed the case, but they were the harshest that New Jersey law then allowed. The Bosquita murder, more than any other single event, forced the American medical and pharmaceutical establishments to acknowledge what they had been avoiding for 30 years. A substance that had been prescribed as a gentle sleep aid was now in the vocabulary of the newspapers of 1900 and 1901, being described as a rape drug. The description was, in the strictest pharmacological sense, correct. Chloral hydrate had been designed to make a person unconscious against their capacity to resist. What its inventors had intended that unconsciousness for was legitimate sleep. What its users had discovered in 100 varieties of establishment across 2 continents was that unconsciousness itself was a resource, and a resource, once identified, will find every possible market. The decline of chloral hydrate, when it finally began, was gradual and multi-causal. In 1903, the same year that Mickey Finn's saloon was closed by Mayor Harrison, the German pharmaceutical firm Bayer introduced a new sedative called veronal, the first of the barbiturate class of drugs. Veronal was, in its early years, marketed as a safer alternative to chloral hydrate. It was more predictable in its dosing. It had a wider margin between therapeutic and lethal doses. It tasted less unpleasant. Physicians, welcoming a genuine improvement in the tools available to them, began to prescribe veronal in preference to chloral. The market share of chloral hydrate, which had dominated the sedative market for more than 3 decades, began to decline. Within a generation, the barbiturates had almost entirely replaced it in ordinary clinical practice. The barbiturates, it would eventually turn out, carried their own catastrophic problems. But that is another story, and the deaths they would cause belonged to another century. At the same time, the infrastructure that had allowed chloral to be weaponized began slowly to be dismantled. In 1915, the United States Congress passed the Seamen's Act, which required merchant sailors to sign their ship's articles in the presence of a federal shipping commissioner, a small change in procedure that eliminated at a single stroke the entire economic basis of the crimping trade. A crimp could no longer simply forge a drugged man's signature and collect his fee. The trapdoors in Miss Pigot's saloon lost their purpose. The boarding houses of Portland and San Francisco emptied their basements. And within a decade, the practice that had haunted the ports of the Western world for 60 years had almost entirely vanished. The steamships helped. As sailing vessels were progressively replaced, from the 1890s onward, by steam-powered ships that required smaller and more skilled crews. The demand for large numbers of untrained bodies that had made Shanghaiing profitable simply disappeared. The trade did not need to be legislated out of existence. It became, in the language of economics, obsolete. The regulation of pharmacies followed a slower and more uneven path. In Britain, the Pharmacy Act and the Dangerous Drugs Act progressively restricted the over-the-counter sale of chloral hydrate and other sedatives through the early 20th century. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 established the first federal framework for controlling the distribution of dangerous drugs, and subsequent legislation extended similar controls to chloral hydrate and its chemical relatives. By the middle of the 20th century, in most industrialized countries, the small brown bottle that had once sat behind every pharmacy counter now required a physician's prescription. The market for casual criminal use collapsed. The bartenders of the American Midwest lost their most reliable tool, but the drug itself did not disappear. It has not disappeared today. Chloral hydrate remains, in the 21st century, a listed pharmaceutical in most countries. In veterinary medicine, it is still used, sometimes, as a sedative for large animals. In pediatric hospitals, it is still used, sometimes, as a preoperative sedative for children undergoing certain procedures. It is manufactured, it is stocked. It has been slowly displaced by newer and safer drugs, and its clinical role has shrunk to a small fraction of what it was in 1880. But it has never been entirely withdrawn from the pharmacopoeia. Somewhere, in a locked medicine cabinet in a hospital in Boston or Berlin or Melbourne, there is still a small brown bottle of the substance that Justus von Liebig produced in his converted barracks laboratory in Gießen on an afternoon in 1832. The physical world remembers too, in small quiet places that most people pass without noticing. The plot in Highgate Cemetery, where Elizabeth Siddal was buried and briefly disinterred, is still there among the Victorian tombstones, largely unmarked and rarely visited. The house at 16 Cheney Walk in Chelsea, where Rossetti spent his last years, still stands, its address occasionally noted on literary walking tours of London. The churchyard at Birchington-on-Sea still holds Rossetti's grave beneath the tombstone designed by Ford Madox Brown. The block of South State Street in Chicago, where the Lone Star Saloon once stood, is now occupied by the Harold Washington Library, the main branch of the Chicago Public Library. A building full of books, where a building full of drugged customers once stood. The waterfront in San Francisco, where Shanghai Kelly ran his trapdoors, is now a district of restaurants and tourist attractions. The mill on Freeland Avenue in Paterson, where Jenny Boschita tended silk ribbons, is long gone, but her grave at Fairlawn Memorial Cemetery, just outside the city, is still there, still tended, still occasionally, still visited. Consider what this means. The story we have been telling tonight is not, in the strictest sense, a story about the past. It is a story about a molecule that still exists, a molecule that was created by a young chemist who did not know what he had made, adopted by a profession that did not fully understand what it was prescribing, released into a marketplace that was never designed to contain it, weaponized by men who had never studied pharmacology, and eventually, slowly, incompletely, brought under a form of control that even now is not perfect. The pattern of chloral hydrate is the pattern of every synthetic sedative that has come after it. The barbiturates followed it. The benzodiazepines followed the barbiturates. The Z drugs followed the benzodiazepines. Each generation of sleep medication has been introduced with the same promises of gentleness, of safety, of a new and better solution to the ancient problem of the sleepless mind. Each generation has produced, in its own way, its own casualties, its own Rossettis, its own Tyndalls, its own Jennies, and its own quiet, unnamed dead in bedrooms whose windows we will never see. There is a young logger, still, somewhere in the imagination, waking on the deck of a merchant ship bound for Yokohama. There is a widowed painter, still, in a house on Cheney Walk, mixing whiskey and chloral in the half-light of a London evening. There is a scientist in a Surrey bedroom, tasting sweetness on his lips and understanding, quietly, what has happened. There is a young girl in a private room at Sal's saloon, drinking sparkling wine that she has been told is only sparkling wine. And there is, at the beginning of all of it, a chemist in Gießen in the early afternoon light of 1832, setting a small colorless crystal down on a laboratory bench and turning his attention to the next experiment. He does not know. He cannot possibly know. That is the story of chloral hydrate. That is the story we have been telling tonight. And in the quiet that follows, if you are still here, if you have not yet drifted, you may take from it whatever meaning seems to you most true. Sleep well.